They weren't just leaders. They were architects of change. In a time of shifting tides, Omax Gardner and Fay Webb stood at the crossroads of tradition and progress, shaping policy, community, and culture. Their influence stretched across generations, leaving a mark still felt today. This is the story of how they helped shape the Old North State.
So my name is Rob Christensen. I wrote about politics, North Carolina politics for the News Observer here in the state capitol for 45 years. I am the author of 3 books about North Carolina politics that are published by UNC Press.
Natalie Bishop. I am the Dean of the Library at Gardner-Webb University and the University Archivist.
I'm Dr. Timothy Vanderberg. I have a PhD from Mississippi State University. Got a master's degree in history from UNCC and have a bachelor's in social science from Gardner-Webb College before it was a university.
The most appreciated gift I received from Christmas was a framed letter written by my father from Raleigh while a member of the North Carolina legislature to my mother in 1858, 24 years before I was born. I was the youngest of 12 children. The gift came from my sister, Mrs. Clyde R. Hoey. In this treasured letter, he tells my mother, "There is nothing else besides thee that is worth loving. My whole affections are lavished on thee, and I know full well thou dost return my love with that affection that none can possess but my kind and affectionate wife. Maggie, do not think of crying any more, but think that you have a husband that loves you with all his heart."
Omax Gardner was born in 1880s here in Shelby in Cleveland County. His family has really long roots here. His father, Dr. O.P. Gardner, was a local doctor, but also a member of the North Carolina legislature. Gardner's mother passed away when he was relatively young, and so he was primarily raised by his 2 older sisters, Ollie and Bess. While his family was not poor by any means, they were probably kind of slightly below. Still a professional family because his father was a doctor, but they would not have been able to live on that salary alone. And so Gardner references throughout his life a lot of experience with farming. So they also, ran their own farm on the side.
Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, farming wasn't just a job, it was how most families survived. Even if your father was a doctor or a politician like Omax Gardner's, you still grew your own food, tended animals, and worked the land. Cash was scarce, stores were few, so you raised what you ate. You sold what you didn't need, and if your crops failed, everything failed. And that never left Omax. Years later, when he became governor, he made agriculture a cornerstone of his policy because he knew firsthand that farming could carry people through the hardest times.
One of the major aims of my administration shall be to improve agriculture and rural life in North Carolina. The North Carolina farmer is in a desperate condition, but he by no means suffers a monopoly of misfortune.
He went on to get a college education, which was not very common for this area.
He was a good, interesting combination of both brains and brawn. As a big football player, he played tackle.
I played football in my time. I learned its language and came to know its code. And as is usually the case with any great sport, its picturesque language has a way of adapting itself to most of the problems and situations of life, and that its code of honor and sportsmanship and its spiritual and moral discipline have implications as fundamental and far-reaching as the rules for a wholesome life.
And he also he taught organic chemistry at NC State. Then he went on to UNC Law School.
Mr. Omax Gardner was graduated at this college and for 2 years after graduation was instructor in chemistry here. During these years, I had opportunity to know him well as a man of fine presence, affable manner, good mind, and upright character. He has first-rate capacity for work and will, I feel sure, do in a satisfactory manner all work that he may be willing to undertake. He has one quality that is very essential to success in law. He knows how to get along with men and how to command their respect.
After he got out of law school, he went back to his home in Shelby, and he married a local girl who was the daughter of a very prominent politician.
I was born in Shelby, North Carolina on September 7th, 1885, to James Landrum Webb and his wife, Kansas Andrews Webb.
So James Webb is Fay Webb Gardner's father. His father was also James Webb. So the original James Webb, what I'm going to call the grandfather, did a lot of what they called church planting. So, he formed a lot of churches in this area. They were heavily involved in First Baptist Shelby, which was highly influential within the county and the town of Shelby. At the time when he was preaching in this area, it was still Rutherford County. So Cleveland County didn't form until 1841. And so he was very prominent across what is currently Rutherford County and now Cleveland County. His son, James Webb, Fay's father, he became a judge and also was part of the North Carolina State Legislature.
Judge Webb was full of the meal of human kindness. He was never overruled by the Supreme Court in a criminal case, and in civil appeals, fewer reverses than any other judge in the state. This record speaks for itself.
James Love, which is Fay's other grandfather, donated the original 40 acres that became the town of Shelby. So they are extremely influential.
The influence that the Webb family had was likely what allowed Fay Webb to attend the Lucy Cobb Institute in Athens, Georgia. The Lucy Cobb Institute was an outstanding girls' school of the South that was known for educating daughters of affluent families, offering a curriculum that combined academic rigor with instruction in gentility. Not only was the Webb family influential in Fay's education, but their legacy would also quietly shape the political future of North Carolina.
In 1907, November 6th, I married Omax Gardner at the First Baptist Church at high noon.
And immediately launched into a very public life. I always get the impression that they were incredibly devoted. If you look at photographs of them, they're looking at one another, smiling or beaming. A lot of times they're physically in close proximity to one another. They might be holding hands. And that's also not something you typically see in photographs of people from the same time period in political roles. So that tends to kind of lend itself to thinking there was a really strong degree of affection between them.
I remember one of the last press conferences my grandfather gave before his death. Reporters asked him, what was the most important thing? He said, well, the most important event in my life was the day I asked Fay Webb to marry me, and she said yes. Said that was number one. And they were very close. She was more of a politician, honestly, I think, than my grandfather.
He recognized that in her in terms of a partnership, and I think he utilized it. I've talked to different members of the family before, and they all repeatedly say he could not have performed socially without the social capital and skills that she brought into that marriage. That is not to say that he was some socially inept person bumbling around, but he just didn't have the knack for it the way that she did, he would have her stand first in a receiving line, which is opposite of what is typical at the time period. Normally the male host would be first in a receiving line. He flipped that. So that way, by the time they got to him, she had already fed to him information about who it was he was about to interact with. And she just kind of had all of this information on Rolodex in her mind and was able to perform that in a really natural way. And so it kind of made him more successful socially than he might have been on his own.
Theirs was a union of rare depth, rooted in love and sharpened by intellect. Together, Max and Fay Gardner were more than husband and wife. They were a true political partnership. And through Fay's distinguished lineage, Max stepped into a legacy of power and public service that would help propel them both into the center of North Carolina's political transformation.
If we even think about, Fay's marriage to Omax, you have a family that's comprised of people who are participating in local, state, regional government.
That was like a political dynasty there that he married into, and so he set up a law practice there, and he went into politics. And so he was very active in Democratic politics, and was, even from a very young age, he was taking up a leadership role. And he was seen by some of the power brokers in the state from a very early age as somebody who was a political comer. By the time he was 28, he was elected to the legislature, and by age 33, he was a lieutenant governor of the state.
Elevated to this high position of trust by the unanimous choice of the militant democracy of North Carolina, he has made himself felt along all forward lines of legislation and has materially aided in the progress and welfare of the state. He is the undisputed leader of the young democracy of North Carolina. Following this quick rise in politics, Gardner decided to run for governor of North Carolina in the 1920 election. The only problem, the Simmons machine.
This was a one-party state. Almost everybody was a Democrat, but you had essentially two parties within the Democratic Party. You had liberal Democrats and you had conservative Democrats, and that's how. So it was a two-party system, but it was all within the Democratic Party. The Republicans were mainly in the mountains in the West at that time. Gardner essentially ran as the anti-machine candidate for governor in 1920. The Simmons machine backed a guy named Cameron Morrison, who was a guy, a millionaire from Charlotte, and the Simmons machine was named after Furnifold Simmons, who was the political boss of the state. And he pretty much ran the state during the first decades of the 20th century.
Political machines are powerful, organized groups that control local or regional politics through patronage, votes, and favors. Led by influential bosses, they secure loyalty from voters, often in exchange for jobs and services. Their influence shapes political careers and policies, leaving a lasting impact on the dynamics of American politics.
And so, election day, actually Omax Gardner had won the Democratic primary against Cameron Morrison in 1920, but they used absentee ballots, particularly up in the mountains, so they would send thousands and thousands of ballots, which the local political bosses would fill out for themselves. And so, election day, the margin grew smaller and smaller, and after several days, Morrison was declared winner. So the Simmons machine basically stole the election from Gardner. Now, he did not run for a governor 4 years later, 1928, in part because at that time there was a system of every 4 years you get a governor from the east and a governor from the west.
During the 20th century, North Carolina's Democratic Party often followed an informal rotation, alternating between governors from the east and other regions like the Piedmont and west. This east-west system ensured that different parts of North Carolina felt represented in the state government.
So from 1920, he lost in the Democratic primary in a race that was probably stolen. And then for 8 years, he was out of power. So he practiced law during those 8 years. He started his own textile mill in Shelby. And when he ran for governor again in 1928, he had the backing of the Simmons machine. And essentially his own organization basically absorbed the Simmons machine, and it became the Shelby dynasty, which really ruled the state from around 1928 to 1948.
This occasion marks another quadrennial in North Carolina's onward march. I take the oath of office of governor humbly in this distinguished presence, deeply conscious of its great responsibilities and seriously impressed with its true significance. I am taking office today a free man. I owe no private obligation to any man or interest aside and apart from the public good. Today, I become the governor of all the people of North Carolina, and shall consecrate myself anew to the services of my state, and it shall be my definite aim and unfaltering purpose to deal justly with every individual and every interest in North Carolina.
So he was elected, he took office in early 1929. In September 1929, the world came crashing down.
I am satisfied that I am facing the gravest situation that has confronted North Carolina since the Civil War. Many of our people are bankrupt, and large numbers have accepted the psychology of defeat.
And so you may remember from your grandparents or your great-grandparents the stories about how tremendous unemployment all across the country, and that included North Carolina. The more than 100 cities and counties declared bankruptcy because people could no longer pay their taxes. The price for agriculture commodities crashed. Everything crashed, and it was a really difficult time.
But economic collapse wasn't just a story of numbers and lost farms. In North Carolina, the crisis hit another nerve, the already struggling textile mills. As the Depression deepened, wages fell, hours stretched, and conditions worsened. Workers didn't just suffer, they organized.
Textile mills were hurting because of the Great Depression, and so they actually were hurting earlier, but the Depression made it worse. So we began having a series of unions coming into the area, particularly from the north, like the American Federation of Labor and some others that were trying to organize the unions. And so it led to a series of strikes starting in 29.
In some instances, there was a lot of violence, and strikers were shot, that sort of thing. It was a really difficult time. It's really hard for us to imagine how difficult it was. And this presented incredible problems for the governor, the new governor. In fact, he at one point said, "What in the world led me to be governor in a period like this? Because it was so difficult."
With the turmoil unfolding in North Carolina due to the Great Depression and labor unrest, the newly elected Governor Omax Gardner worked tirelessly to hold the state together, but he wasn't doing it alone. Inside the governor's mansion, Fay Webb Gardner was making the governor's mansion a place of diplomacy, connection, and strategy. She understood that power wasn't just about policy, it was also about relationships.
Busy all morning getting ready for the party tonight. 22 present for dinner. The table is lovely in Venetian tablecloth. Served tomato juice cocktails and hors d'oeuvres in the drawing room. Then a 6-course dinner afterward. A big time was had by all.
If we think about North Carolina politically at that time compared to other places in the United States, we didn't really have that sort of political, social prominence. People maybe thought of it a little more as like Deep South as opposed to sort of the Washington, D.C. scene. She redecorated or redesigned the governor's mansion. She redid the gardens, those type of things. So while, people look back and be like, oh, well, that's nice, it was done with a specific purpose in mind.
People like to have dinner with the governor. And so there were all kinds of people in North Carolina, the leaders of North Carolina, legislators, business people, but also, famous people would come in, like Franklin Roosevelt, who was governor of New York, and that sort of thing, would come and dine with him, and famous celebrities.
President Roosevelt's lunch was chicken with rice, baked beans, and rolls, Bavarian cream with preserves and cake. Wine was served along with iced tea made at the table by Mrs. Roosevelt.
She is trying to emulate what she sees with her friends, like the Roosevelts, the Trumans, the Johnsons. She's trying to bring that here so that we're playing on the same playing field. She understood how social capital could be leveraged in a political situation.
While Fay Webb Gardner was working quietly behind the scenes to enhance the political atmosphere in Raleigh and leverage her social relationships, the situation in North Carolina was spiraling out of control. The economic hardship brought on by the Great Depression was getting worse. Labor unrest was increasing, and it was clear that without strong leadership, North Carolina was on the verge of unraveling.
Things continued to get worse and worse, not only in North Carolina, but across the country.
But he really makes the most out of a terrible situation in a governor role.
The first thing he did was he would try to reassure people. So he would go on and have what were later called fireside chats.
Popularized by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933, fireside chats were an effective way to communicate with the people through a radio address. Many people had their radio sets in their living rooms, and when FDR came on in the evening, they would gather round, and it would feel as if they were having a chat next to the fire. While it was not an everyday occurrence, Governor Gardner used this same tactic 4 years earlier to help reassure the people of North Carolina during this economic depression.
And he went on the radio and he'd have these chats, and he would, for example, ask people a lot of people lived on the farm back then, right? And so he'd ask them to, grow their own crops and raise their own cows and chickens and that sort of thing. And so that even if they were poor and there was no money coming in, at least they'd be able to eat because they were growing their own and raising their own livestock.
The idea, therefore, that North Carolina must live at home and must make a living on the farm must become a permanent possession of the minds of the people of the state. Live at Home Week seeks to encourage every farmer and every farm tenant to grow sufficient food and feedstuffs to be self-supporting.
This is one of the things that really makes him an outstanding governor, as he took this really difficult situation and figured out some things about how to make it better. What he did was, in May 1930, he went up to Washington, D.C. to a famous think tank called the Brookings Institute. And he got one of the experts there, and they did a 4-month study taking a look at North Carolina.
I submit this morning for your consideration the report of the survey of the organization and administration of county government in North Carolina, prepared by the Institute for Government Research of the Brookings Institution. It should be remembered that this survey undertook to do 2 things. First, to recommend such changes in the financial control and administration of county government. And second, present a long-term program for change and readjustment in the whole setup of county government.
And so the Brookings Institute came back with this report, which Max Gardner used his leadership ability to push through the legislature, that totally revolutionized North Carolina government. So among the things he did, it used to be that every county had their own prison, jails. The state took those over and set up a state prison system.
Also during this time period, he abolished chain gangs in the state of North Carolina. A chain gang, basically if you had been convicted of a crime and you were in a prison, then you would be required to do enforced labor. If you worked on a chain gang, you were physically chained to however many other prisoners were on the chain gang that day.
County convict and chain gang camps present another problem which engages our particular attention at this time as the maintenance of county roads is taken over by the state. I suggest for your consideration the advisability of the erection of district prison camps to care for the present county prisoners and chain gangs.
He helped out towns and counties by taking the full cost of road maintenance and improvement away from the counties.
Schools were all funded by property taxes locally, and the state took that over and paid the cost of education and teacher salaries.
The reorganization, which provided effectively for larger state control of local expenditures, followed two patterns. In the first place, the General Assembly provided the maintenance of those functions of local government which are particularly statewide in effect, as, for example, roads and schools, should be set up as functions of the state.
He also consolidated and essentially created what is now the UNC college system.
So instead of having leadership of different schools, particularly among Chapel Hill and State, he consolidated them so the upper level echelon of their leadership was the same.
But I declare to you, in my judgment, that the consolidation of these three great institutions under one central control will mean more for the future of North Carolina than any other and all other legislation with which we struggle. It makes possible, ultimately, that united support in North Carolina behind one great, unified, coordinated, and intelligently directed educational enterprise.
So this was really, in my mind, brilliant leadership. He took a really terrible situation and he really did something interesting and good with it. But the state was able to continue to pay its employees and to continue to provide services. And he was a national model for this. So he would actually, other states would ask him to go speak to state legislatures about how North Carolina did this.
Governor Gardner's approach to the economic depression was innovative, creative, and effective. His leadership brought a sense of order and direction in a time of national uncertainty. But even as he worked to lead the state through this financial distress, another crisis was unfolding at the same time. Across North Carolina's textile towns, wages were falling, work hours were growing longer, and conditions inside the mills were growing more desperate. Gardner needed to act quick, and in this case, he would not be the national model.
North Carolina was one of the most industrialized states in the country.
Some of the mills were cutting back hours, or they were instituting something called the stretch out, which was working them harder for the same pay, or some of them actually were reducing hours and paying them less. And so we began having a series of unions coming into the area, particularly from the north, like the American Federation of Labor and some others that were trying to organize the unions. And so it led to a series of strikes starting in '29.
Labor disputes was a much more controversial part of Gardner's term. Gardner owned a textile mill himself, a successful one, so he came in as pretty anti-union and very pro-business.
But he also wanted people to make a living wage and have a decent life in the mills and not be paid barely enough to survive.
So there were several huge labor disputes. The biggest one being in Gastonia with the Lower Mills.
Lower A Mill strike was important for two reasons. First of all, the National Textile Workers Union came in and organized them, and they were a communist-led union.
It had, I think, a couple thousand workers, and it was a very bitter strike, and they had to bring in the National Guard, and there were people that were killed during the violence.
Police chief, Gastonia police chief, was actually killed, and one of the rioters was also killed.
In that instance, he very much sided with the owners of the textile mills. But by the early 1930s, there was these vast strikes that were rolling all across the South in the textile mills, involving tens of thousands of workers. And I think some of the commentators of that era noted that he became more sophisticated and less anti-labor. He was now more trying to negotiate between the business and labor.
So that's why I see him as kind of a balanced person who knew the problems
With the labor unrest raging and an economy on the brink, Governor O. Max Gardner spent his term fighting to keep North Carolina afloat. But his story wasn't just forged in the issues of the Depression. Behind closed doors, something else was taking shape, an organization that would come to dominate North Carolina politics for 2 decades.
Well, it basically begins with Gardner becoming governor, winning the race in 28.
He had the backing of the Simmons machine, and essentially his own organization basically absorbed the Simmons machine, and it became the Shelby dynasty. So I think you have to sort of understand that he was a very larger-than-life figure, a very charismatic figure. He liked hanging out with some of the big rich people, and so he would get on the train every year, and they would rent a train and go to the Kentucky Derby, and he would go to the famous fights up in Madison Square Garden. So he very much was operating in that milieu where the rich, he operated among the rich and the famous.
And this is really where Fay plays a huge role.
Fay Webb seemed to thrive off social life.
She understood how social capital could be leveraged in a political situation. There is, instance after instance where Fay is hosting these parties, which seems like a really frivolous thing, but that's where a lot of the sort of backdoor deals happen, were at her parties.
Fay's understanding of how social capital can be used in political situations is truly what laid the groundwork for the success of the Shelby dynasty.
So the Shelby dynasty was it was very pro-business. It was very anti-union. It was led an effort to industrialize the state of North Carolina, and the state made a lot of progress in those years.
But it's the core of the group is Gardner, his father-in-law James Webb, and then his brother-in-law.
So Clyde was married to Gardner's older sister Bess, who helped raise him as a child. Then they brought in other extended family members or, close friends that they had worked with either in, the ag industry or the textile industry, and kind of had this network of politicians at every different level in state politics, whether it was from like a county commission level all the way up to the North Carolina state legislature, all the way up to the governor's office. And this network of relationships with people strategically placed who were by and large on the same page about what they wanted to happen remained in their roles for about 20 to 25 years.
And he used the organization to really to help elect governors, people who he wanted as governors, and defeat senators people he wanted out.
And that is a lot of legislation that can be passed in that amount of time that still, reaches to us in the future today.
Gardner's time as governor was marked by crisis, labor unrest, economic collapse, a state on the edge. But through it all, he reshaped North Carolina in ways no one had before. And when his term ended, his influence didn't. The Shelby dynasty he helped build ensured that Gardner's hand remained on the wheel of state politics long after he left office.
And so he moved to Washington, and he became one of the first really super lobbyists.
Some of the major corporations that he represented was Pennsylvania Railroad, Coca-Cola, Pan American Airways, and also the Cotton Textile Institute.
Not only was he lobbying for these corporations, but he had such a good relationship with Franklin Roosevelt that he was actually helping write speeches. His wife would help Eleanor Roosevelt set up tea parties and that sort of thing. And so he was a social friend and a very close friend. Interestingly enough, he still ran the politics of North Carolina. So for like 16 years, he was up in Washington, and he really ran the political organization. He ran it by telephone, essentially. He had an apartment in the Mayflower Hotel on Connecticut Avenue, and he was able to, he got the North Carolina newspapers delivered to him every day, and on the telephone, he essentially ran the state politics. He could name who was going to be governor, He could help oust a United States senator who was doing poorly. He had pretty much control of the state, running it from his hotel room in Washington, D.C. for the next 16 years.
He also held several presidentially appointed positions for both the Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Harry Truman presidencies.
When President Truman tapped him to be the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, he did that in early 1946, and then he made it known that when it was an opening for an ambassador to England opened up, he made it known to the Truman administration that he would consider being an ambassador to England. But he had some health issues that was starting. In October of 1946, he was at a Carolina Navy game, and while going up the steps to the stadium, he had his first heart attack. He didn't tell anybody. He watched the football game. He was in some distress, but he didn't want to bother anybody, and so they went to saw a doctor and confirmed he had a heart attack. They gave him bed rest for about a month, and then when the ambassador resigned, he was promptly appointed for that and confirmed by the Senate. Should mention that during that time frame, he sold his his financial interest in his textile mill, sold it to J.P. Stevens, and made about $3.6 million. So he became a millionaire like that. He had come back from a gala in Washington, and then was at their apartment in Washington, and the next day they were to ship out. About 3 in the morning, he had a massive heart attack and died. Never made it to England.
Though he never set foot in England as ambassador, his influence at home was undeniable. Back in North Carolina, the mark he left was deep and enduring. Through his influence in politics, help from his wife, and his vision for the future, he shaped the state's modern identity. His legacy would not be measured by the title he never held, but by the lasting impact he made on the place he always called home.
He very much had a very lasting impact. He became a very influential figure, both in North Carolina and nationally, even though his only public office was those 4 years as governor, and then before that 4 years as lieutenant governor.
I think we can't be amiss of his support for Gardner-Webb University. He and his wife helped save the university.
In 1942, the university was a college, and we were in some financial distress. So we had weathered the storm of the Great Depression better than most, but we were not in great shape. And so the different members of the Board of Trustees at that point in time, they reach out to different prominent people. The Gardners were two of those people, and Fay is the one that really talks to Governor Gardner about, hey, this is our community, this is an important institution within our community, we need to support them.
He gave money personally to Gardner-Webb, and he brought in a tremendous amount of money during his lifetime to Gardner-Webb.
What's interesting is at the time the Board of Trustees said, okay, well, we're going to change our name from Boiling Springs College to Gardner College. And Max Gardner turned them down. He said the only way that he would consider it is if they would also name it after his wife, because Fay was the one that was really in their corner and spoke up for them. So that's how we became Gardner-Webb.
He also is given some credit for keeping the NFL going, the National Football League going during the World War II. There was some thought that during the world, an all-out war, you shouldn't be playing football. But he took some leading people to a football game there to see the Washington, what was then called the Washington Redskins, and showed them that like 40% of the crowd were young guys in uniform. So it was that sports provided a release for people who were fighting.
After the governor's passing, She operated several industrial businesses in the textile area, and she was very involved in the running of the business. She wasn't just this sort of figurehead person. She was very conscious about supporting different philanthropic charities and organizations, not just in Cleveland County, but in our regional area. She was thought well enough as a political savvy planner that in the 1960s she was invited to spearhead the Democratic National Convention twice.
If O. Max Gardner would come back today and looked at the state government in Raleigh, he would recognize it because it was pretty much what he set up back in the 1930s. He owned a textile mill, and he was a lawyer, and he had charisma, and he had smarts, and he had this big booming voice and this commanding presence, and he was an exceptional political figure. Helped North Carolina become modernized and industrialized and become the state it has.